Welcome back, everybody. The History Guy here. Well, we're ready to continue on playing through this No Infantry campaign challenge in Ultimate General Civil War. And I went through and I played the Battle of Gaines Mill, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, none of my audio recorded, at least not my voice, through the microphone. So what I am doing instead of replaying the battle, because the battle actually ends up going really well for me in the end, and I'm taking all the suspense out of it that way because it didn't seem that way for a while. So I'm going to record a voiceover. I'm going to talk through some of what's happening in the battle, but also just talk a little bit about the historical battle rather than trying to narrate every little movement that I make during this battle. So my overall strategy is this. I have 20 brigades that make up my first corps, and then 10 in the second corps that arrives on the field. It's actually the second corps that's first and the first corps that's second, but that doesn't necessarily matter. I put all of my melee cavalry in the reinforcements that won't arrive until about the last hour and a half of the battle. Now, that may seem like maybe not the best strategy, but hear me out and watch it play out on the battlefield. I've put all of my artillery, or almost all of my artillery, and my skirmishers and my mounted infantry in the part of the army that will hold the field for the majority of it. It means I'm going to be heavily outnumbered and outgunned. But, well, maybe not outgunned. I think I may have more cannon than him. But it'll be enough to hold. They'll inflict heavy losses on the enemy. And then watch the fun that I have when suddenly 9 melee cavalry units arrive on the battlefield all at once and just ride roughshod over a depleted enemy force. I end up causing significant casualties. So, but the first part's tricky and it's hard because it's a lot of moving around, micromanaging units, trying to get on his flank, trying to use my artillery, trying to figure out where he's going to hit. And he primarily hits me first on my right side. But then as he gets reinforcements, he comes around the flanks, further to the right, and then over on my left. So as that's all going down, I'm going to go ahead and take some time just to talk about the historic Battle of Gaines Mill as things are happening on the battlefield. So the Battle of Gaines Mill, when it was fought in June of 1862, is actually sometimes called the First Battle of Cold Harbor because this is actually on the exact same battlefield where the much more famous Battle of Cold Harbor actually took place 2 years later during the summer of 1864. So it's sometimes known that way, and if you visit the battlefield today, you'll see that they're basically in the exact same spot. Even though they were much different battles, the casualties actually ended up very similar, even though Cold Harbor was a multiple-day affair and Gaines Mill was just one day, June 27th, 1862, I believe. Yep. It was also the very first major victory of the war for General Robert E. Lee, who had, of course, many victories to come after this one. Now you can see here that I'm trying to screen with my mounted infantry against his units because they were sneaking up on my last couple of units of artillery, which kind of got bogged down as I was pulling them back to the main line. But I was able to get them back successfully and get everybody into position so I could begin to hold. It's hard to hold those fortifications when they're long like that, and especially when you've only got 300 or 400 or 500 men in a unit trying to hold them. So it gets a little tricky, and of course they get knocked out of there quite a few times, which I expected. Which is why I kind of parked some additional units behind them to kind of hold those positions, and I keep the guns back far enough that when my skirmishers get dislodged, the guns can still inflict a bunch of casualties, which will drive off the invaders before they're able to push through and hit my artillery, at least until late in the battle, when they do end up hitting a couple of my batteries. So one of the other things that distinguishes the Battle of Gaines Mill is that it was probably the largest assault of the entire Civil War, frontal assault on a position. It was larger than Pickett's Charge. It was larger than the assault at Cold Harbor here 2 years later. It was larger than the Confederate assault at Franklin. It was larger than the Union assault at Fredericksburg. Lee unleashes like 32,000 men and 16 brigades in this assault on the federal lines during the Battle of Gaines Mill, which was almost 3 times larger than Pickett's charge. Now, granted, it wasn't across an open field in front of a really heavily fortified elevated position like that battle, but even the attack at Franklin was only about 20,000. Of course, that frontal assault happened late in the day. It happened around 7 p.m. at Gaines Mill once Lee had most of his forces on the battlefield. So he still hasn't even gotten to the place where he's going to engage me yet. He really doesn't start to engage me until the next phase of the battle, which is still about 8 minutes away on here. All right, so now we're on to the second phase of the battle, and this is where he's finally going to start to assault my position. And one of my strategies here is that when he starts to bring his men in, I'm going to try to get around on his flanks with those mounted infantry units. You can see I've got one on each of my flanks. Now, it doesn't work out that way on the left, but that was kind of the plan. But the one on the right, I actually was able to do a lot of damage with early on in his assault here. As you can see, it's coming. I also started to shift some units over because I could see that most of his attack was coming on my right side. So I started to shift over to account for that. And of course, eventually I'm going to have to shift some of them back because he starts to hit the left flank, but not until later on in the battle. So at the point in time, obviously very early in the war still, but this was the second bloodiest battle in American history at this point, only second to the Battle of Shiloh, which had happened in April of that year. There were 15,500 casualties at this battle, which were just massive, and actually I think equal to or probably greater than all of the American casualties lost in the entire Revolutionary War to that point. So I kind of paused to kind of take a look at things here for a second and get my artillery to focus on his battery that's back there. I've got my 3 units of rifled artillery, my 2 10-pounder Parrots and my 20-pounder Parrots sitting back a little further. And so I started targeting his artillery with those. And then here's where I'm going to go ahead and get... I started to go after his flank, but then I noticed when I went out there that he had this other unit. He was trying to send a couple of brigades way out and around my right side to try and hit that objective over there. And I caught them in the act of that. So I went up and hit him, and even after just one volley, they broke. So then I was able to bring them back and start hitting his flank. My artillery is really what made the difference in this battle. And you'll see that as time goes on. So here's where I finally get into him a little bit on his flank, and this really does make a big difference. I think one of the things that has been fun for me in this series is that it has forced me to learn how to micromanage better, particularly how to micromanage some of these smaller units like skirmishers, cavalry, mounted infantry, artillery. They've always been a part of the Army, but I've always, like a lot of people, focused most of my time and attention on my infantry brigades, who do the bulk of the fighting. And that meant that I never really fully and effectively have used some of these other units who could really make a big difference on the battlefield because of the micromanaging involved. So this has actually been really fun for me because you get to see what a difference they can make on the field. I mean, just riding up with a unit of these mounted infantry troops and hitting a flank and firing a volley, you can see how quickly it forces the units from the field. Just getting 1 or 2 volleys into a unit on their flank can drive them back, whereas that isn't necessarily always the case with infantry. So I'm going to let this play out a little bit. We'll watch a little bit of the action, and then I'll come back with some more facts about the battle. So here's his first major kind of foray into assaulting my works with his troops in a melee combat. And that, of course, is the big fear in this for me. If he would have massed all his troops at once, there's no way I could have stopped him. But he does this where he'll send in 1 or 2 brigades at a time and allows me the opportunity to be able to withstand those attacks. So I'm able to hit him with my artillery. As soon as that unit breaks into my lines, they may push me back temporarily, but you can see the canister fire just quickly causes major casualties and drives him back in a hurry. Meanwhile, I'm kind of micromanaging with these mounted infantry troops over here, and they end up really making a big difference for me. You'll see later on, at one point I checked their casualties, and they had inflicted 500 casualties and only lost something like 40 men. So they made a huge, huge difference for me in this battle. Alright, another fact for you. This was one of those rare battles during the American Civil War where the Confederates actually outnumbered the Union on the battlefield. Because of the nature of the 7 days, and you can see that I'm getting my 4th division of my 2nd Corps, which is the first corps that enters the field. And with that comes a bunch more artillery as well as some more skirmishers and sharpshooters with those telescopic sight John Browns. Got flanked when I sent out my mounted infantry here to try and hit his flank, and I do that effectively, but I take a couple shots from his artillery sitting up there, which is why they got flanked. But they still do their job, and you can see I drive off basically the entire force, which buys me some time to get these other reinforcements up, because he's starting to send his whole force around to my right flank. Still nothing happening on my left at this point, which is why I decided to go ahead and move these skirmishers over to help reinforce the center. Now that'll come back to bite me later when I have to send him back over to the left when he gets reinforcements. So yeah, the Confederates had about 60 to 65,000 men on this field, and the Union only had about 34,000. Because of the nature of the Peninsula Campaign, what was happening was you have all these rivers and kind of swampy areas, and that meant that at times the Union forces got divided by major waterways. And this battle, like a lot of the battles, was primarily led by John Porter, who was a corps commander in the Union Army, rather than McClellan, who I think was down with illness at this point in the battle, at this point in the campaign. So this is kind of the calm before the storm here, and I run into these skirmishers right here. So he was probing, trying to get his troops over to be able to hit that objective over there. So I park some artillery up there, and then eventually I'm going to bring these sharpshooters around and get on these guys' flank. And there's going to be a lot of this kind of micromanaging out on the edges while trying to hold the main line. You can see for the first time now, he's starting to send troops over at my left, so I have to go ahead and reinforce them and prepare for basically what's going to be an assault all the way along the line. And it gets to the point where I'm just hanging on by a thread when my melee cavalry finally arrives on this battlefield. And that's when the fun really begins in this battle. Of course, the 7 days fight was such a debacle for the Union. Now here comes his melee assault on my left, which is pretty effective for a minute. My mounted infantry fell back pretty far for some reason. I have to rush them up to try and get on these guys' flank, and they get there just in time to kind of do that job. They get in there and fire on their flanks, because I don't have a lot of artillery on this side because the main attack was happening over on the other side. McClellan had such an opportunity during the 7 days fight if he would have just pressed it, but being as cautious as he often was, he moved ahead so slowly and allowed his army to be attacked kind of a piece at a time. He ends up facing Robert E. Lee, who he feels is actually a much less talented general than Joseph Johnston. He felt like it was going to get easier fighting against Lee. Boy, was he mistaken on that one. And he constantly thought the Confederates had more men than him. He had the Pinkerton agency kind of as his scouts giving him information. They were giving him bad information, and he was already cautious anyway. And so he kept asking for more men, more men. He's wiring back to Washington saying, I need more men to press this attack. And he never did press the attack, and he eventually gets driven off the peninsula. And once he's driven off the peninsula, Robert E. Lee immediately seizes the initiative, and he starts marching north, and that's when you have the Second Manassas Campaign, and then eventually the Battle of Antietam. So this is one of the battles that kind of leads to fame for individual units. The Texas Brigade under John Bell Hood kind of achieved its first making a name for itself at the Battle of Gaines' Mill. It was the 1st Texas, the 4th Texas, the 5th Texas, and the 18th Georgia, as well as Hampton, South Carolina Legion. So it wasn't all Texas, but it was primarily Texas. And they led the charge that broke the Union line at the top of the Watt House Hill. And that was kind of what helped seal the Confederate victory here at Gaines' Mill. It was kind of right in the center to the center left of the fight. So there's still about 48 minutes to go in this part of the campaign, and then there's still one last phase to the battle after this, and it's that last phase about an hour into the last phase. So I've still got about 2 hours until my melee cavalry arrives on the field. You can see he's starting to get more and more men over here on my right side. So at this point I'm getting pretty nervous because I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to hold up against all of this. My 4th Division's finally arriving on the field with the additional artillery, which makes a big difference for me. But this is the first point at which I'm wondering whether or not I'm going to hang on for dear life. So at the Battle of Gaines' Mill, 7 men on the Union side were eventually given the Medal of Honor. I'm not sure that the Medal of Honor even existed yet during the Battle of Gaines' Mill, but a number of Medals of Honor were given retrospectively after the fact when the medal was instituted. One of the men who received the Medal of Honor for his actions at the Battle of Gaines' Mill was Dan Butterfield. Dan Butterfield is not a widely known character from the Civil War. He was a brigade commander. His brigade, I believe, actually contained the 20th Maine, who went on to great fame for themselves at Gettysburg, where their commanding officer, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, was given the Medal of Honor. But Dan Butterfield is best known as the man who composed taps. Taps is what you hear played at military funerals. That song. If you're an American, I'm sure you're familiar with it. They play it often at military funerals and also at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery whenever they do a wreath-laying ceremony there, which I got to be a part of in 8th grade. I was able to lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns. Among the 7 are a man named Charles Hopkins, who lived until 1934, over 70 years after the actions he received the Medal of Honor for. There was a man named Ernest von Vegesack. Vegesack, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was a Swedish man who actually later became a member of the Swedish Parliament. He received the Medal of Honor for Gaines' Mill. A man named John Henry Moffett, who later became a U.S. congressman from the state of New York. All received the Medal of Honor for their actions here at Gaines' Mill. Alright, so the micromanaging continues, just constantly trying to perceive where the threats are and moving to try and hold the line against those threats. One of the nice things about having mounted infantry and skirmishers versus traditional artillery or infantry units is that they're a lot quicker to move around the battlefield. So even though I'm outnumbered, and I'm going to be outnumbered all the time, I can move units quickly as needed to kind of face the threats, and then just allow my artillery to kind of stand firm and hopefully drive off anybody that comes along. You can see he's got more and more infantry coming down from that right side, and that's really where the main threat is at this point. Just constantly trying to move troops around to face these threats. We're just about done with this phase. We move into the last phase of the battle, and that's where I start desperately hoping for that cavalry to arrive. Alright, so here we go into the last phase of the fight, and he's going to get even more reinforcements, and that's when his first real threat to my left materializes late in the battle. And I send all my cavalry to the right, thinking that's where the main threat is, and so then that kind of frees me up to start shifting some of these units on the right over to the left, just in time to hold against that threat. Here comes another major melee attack, this time on my left side, kind of in the center of the fight. And that one breaks me, but again, that's where a lot of my artillery is, so that helps. Gaines Mill is the first time where both sides at the same time used observation balloons. You actually can see this. I pause here for just a second to kind of figure out what's going on. I do that a couple of times in this last phase. There's a series from the 1980s called The Blue and the Gray, which is phenomenal. I highly recommend it if you're interested in the Civil War. It's really well done and doesn't focus so much on the major famous stories of the war, but on a couple of families whose lives were forever changed because of the war. I think it really shows the home front well. But they show some Confederate soldiers who go up in a balloon during the Peninsula Campaign. But it was used on both sides to kind of monitor the situation. They weren't heavily used after that. I mean, here and there, but it was the Civil War kind of was innovative in many ways for kind of the new things that were used for the first time. So he drives me back in the center pretty effectively here, and this is one of those nervous moments for me during this fight. So you can see now he's starting to mass a lot of troops very near to my line, and I'm getting more and more nervous, wondering how I'm going to hold. Watching that clock, hoping that very soon the cavalry arrives. Quite literally waiting for the cavalry to ride in and save the day. Now, speaking of cavalry, there was a cavalry charge on the Union side late in this battle, trying to turn the tide of the battle. Actually happened at the same place where the Texas Brigade made their assault, the Watt House Plateau. That cavalry charge was led by Brigadier General Philip St. George Cooke, who isn't somebody who's particularly well known from the Civil War, but he happened to be the father-in-law of Confederate cavalry commander Jeb Stuart. So just kind of one more of those kind of weird quirks of the Civil War being family against family. Cook was from Virginia. He was from Northern Virginia, Leesburg, which isn't far from Washington, D.C., but he stayed loyal to the Union. When Cook decided to stay loyal to the Union, Jeb Stuart was asked about it, and his quote was that he will regret it only once, and that will be continually. You can see here, major assault happening, and just then the cavalry arrives. You have no idea how excited I was when I saw these guys arrive on the battlefield. And the fun is about to commence, because watch the fun that I have with these guys. I just pounce on entire brigades of infantry and swallow them up. This is a lot of fun now. I hung on barely by the skin of my teeth in order to have this payoff for this battle. So let's watch the fun. Of course, they're riding through the woods, so it takes them a little bit of time to get into position. Gotta get General Grant out of the way there. So here they come, and it's just lovely to see how quickly they gobble up some of these units. I gotta get my supplies up to try and resupply some of these other units. And now that the cavalry has arrived, I can start. You can see now his reinforcements are coming, and they're about to hit my left. So I start shifting some units over to meet that threat, because my cavalry's all on the right side. They're not going to be able to do anything to help, at least not yet. But this is fun to watch. Oh yeah, oh yeah. The locusts descend on the crops and just devour them. It's glorious to behold. Now, I do have a couple of hairy moments later on with some of my cavalry, as you'll see. At one point, they get dragged into a situation and they get stuck. So here I pause for just a second because I need to start shifting some units over to meet this threat that's coming on my left side. There's only an hour and a half left in the battle. And now we move on, and we gobble up some artillery, and I can come in, and it's really lovely. These infantry are facing the wrong direction, so the cavalry, they're not even going to know what hit them. Meanwhile, just kind of hanging on over on the left, and it looks like my troops are doing okay over there. And it just, you can see how quickly entire units just dissolve. And then eventually I start seeing units that actually surrender instead of breaking apart. And I have to be cautious here because you can see now he's got a number of units there. And I don't want to hit one unit and then have the units behind them hit me with a volley and cause massive casualties. But as a couple of them break, that's when I see my opportunity to pounce in. So much fun. And this is why I chose to do it this way. I could have put a couple of those melee cavalry units in the other corps that arrived first, but they wouldn't have been real effective. I mean, here and there, but because he had multiple units in various places, I would have been largely sitting back with them anyway. So I figured if I could hang on with those other units and then send all of my cavalry at one time, I could be really effective, and it pays off big time. That's the thing with cavalry. I mean, you either have to get isolated in the open units to go after, or you have to have a whole bunch of cavalry. So one of his units surrendered. You can see it's getting quieter on the battlefield. My right flank and my center are now secure, and now it's a matter of running up, grabbing these supplies, and then moving over on his left. There's an hour to go. Or on my left, I should say, his right. Alright, gonna grab those supplies. Of course, the tricky part there is that I accidentally hit the route button instead of the hold button to tell them not to fire. Tricky part is as soon as they capture one unit of supplies, they immediately cancel the hold command and then fire on the other one. Grab the other supplies now. Now right here is where I get myself into a little bit of trouble. Not quite yet, but what ends up happening is I'm trying to push these couple of units down. And as I push, and then I eventually push back up to the north, I end up getting sucked into the woods against a unit. And my cavalry gets stuck, and they start taking casualties, and I can't get them out. And so I actually take a number of casualties that I probably shouldn't have. But now I'm relieving the pressure on my left flank. And I think I end up getting these units to surrender as well. Another unit broken. And you can see there that I start getting a little nervous now because I know Stonewall Jackson's got troops coming in, and this is where I'm exposing my flank a little bit. But I get far enough away that I feel like I'm okay to go ahead and press the attack. But I'm getting into the woods too, and that's never a good sign for cavalry. So right up here in the top of the screen, this is where I get into trouble. I think, okay, I'm all right. I'm going to push these guys right into the other unit, and I'll hit both of them. But then right there, I start to see that there are reinforcements behind that, and he's got units that start firing on me. And my cavalry gets stuck right here. And I start to try to pull them out, and they take a bunch of casualties while I'm trying to get them out of there. And right here is where I try to pull them out, and it takes a while to do that. Just 28 minutes to go. Finally, they start disengaging. Another unit surrenders on his side. Of course, manpower is not an issue for me, so these surrenders don't do me a lot of good, because I've already got 70,000 men or so in my force pool that I can't use. But you can see how quiet the battlefield has gotten now, as most of his forces are gone. Alright, we grab some more supplies, and then we kill Generals Hill and Longstreet, who I'm sure will reappear in the next battle anyway. And that pretty much does it. That's it, except for looking at the casualties, which are lovely. Now, I won't be able to read the casualties because when I'm doing these voiceovers, the preview screen is actually kind of small for me. But there you have the casualties for the battle. You can read those for yourself. They're pretty overwhelming in my favor. And, of course, I also grab a lot of supplies and various weapons. See, I know I'm pointing to and talking about these, but I can't read any of it right now. It's too small for me on my screen. So let's look at the, you can see the weapons and especially the supplies that I grabbed. The supplies are huge because that's a lot of money. That is something I do need a good deal of. And the nice thing here is the only two losses that I suffer among my leaders are 1 killed and 1 wounded among my majors. And instead what I've gained are a bunch of brigadier generals and a bunch of colonels, which are really helpful moving forward. And here are the individual unit casualties. You can see some of my units did really, really well. So going back now, what we're looking at is we're going right into another major battle right off the bat, the Battle of Malvern Hill. So as you often do, I certainly welcome any and all input as to not only the strategy of the battle I just fought, but also the battle that is to come. You can see what I've got available: 400,000 in money, 70,000 troops, no cavalry weapons that I can buy, no skirmisher weapons, no artillery even. So the only thing I might spend on would be more money. Thankfully, I should be replenished now in my armory because it was a major battle. So I don't know how much more I will have gained from that. But I can look here and see that I can take 30 brigades, which is exactly what I took into this last fight at Gaines Mill. So basically, I'm just going to replenish the troops I already have, maybe make some changes to the composition of those units and mix it up so it's a little more even. The last thing, though, to do is career points. And I know you guys aren't going to like this, but I desperately need to know what's happening on the battlefield. And so I end up putting these 2 points into recon. After this, I'll probably go back to either army organization or into, I guess I don't know what it's called. Is it financial? I can't read it from here. Treasury, whatever it is, where it costs less to buy guns, because money's an issue for me, not manpower. So at least now I'll know at all times how many men he has on the field. That's going to be helpful for me in knowing how aggressive I can be with my cavalry. But that's about it. So as always, I welcome any and all input. Please use the comment section below. Hit that thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Sorry that I had to go back and do a voiceover for this one. I didn't expect it to go this way. But thanks for watching, guys. I'm having a lot of fun with this. We'll see you again next time.